Breaking news this hour, billionaire Elon Musk now reached a new deal to acquire Twitter for approximately $44 billion. The outspoken Tesla CEO, who's also the world's richest person, has said he wanted to buy Twitter because he thinks it's not living up to its potential as a platform for free speech. He says it needs to be transformed as a private company in order to better build trust with users and to do better at serving what he calls the societal imperative of free speech. Musk now celebrating this move, saying this on Twitter that, quote, free speech is the bedrock of a functioning democracy, and Twitter is the digital town square where matters vital to the future of humanity are debated. For reaction to this story, we're joined live this hour by Daniel Chai. He is a lecturer with the Institute of Communication, Culture, Information and Technology at the University of Toronto. Thanks so much for making time.
Thank you for having me.
So let's start with Elon Musk's vision for this company. He's promising this new focus on democracy and free speech. What will Elon Musk's Twitter look like, and how could this change in leadership change our lives?
It's interesting. He's come out and talked about creating an open source approach to algorithms. So we've heard a lot about algorithms with Facebook, other sites in terms of how they work. It's a black box, but we do know that they tend to promote negative content and negative sentiment. So he wants to open source that. The other thing he wants to do is also ensure there's authentication of all users to avoid bots, the use of trolls and bot accounts to infiltrate the internet, the Twitter, and to have these fake accounts change discourse. So these are some of the things that he's talking about in terms of reforming it, as well as being able to make it more commercializable for businesses to advertise on the site.
Okay, so in the spirit of free speech, do you expect people like Donald Trump will be invited eventually back on Twitter? What will this mean for Twitter's community standards? I mean, when we talk about content moderation, what does that really look like?
Well, what's interesting is we know that negative sentiment works. Disinformation, controversy, very tumultuous types of commentary increases engagement, gets people onto social media platforms. It's no different with Twitter. By having somebody like the former president, Donald Trump, removing his ban on Twitter and having him become an active user would certainly increase engagement and also increase the possibility of additional profits for the business.
So you talked a little bit about this. I just want to loop back to this idea of profitability. How will all this talk about democracy and free speech really impact business for Twitter, especially when it comes to advertising?
Well, right now, businesses are somewhat squeamish on advertising on Twitter as a marketing advertising platform because of the extreme political nature of the content. Twitter's really known for not like happy videos. It's more known for its hard-hitting political debates and speech. So that tends to turn off large multinationals that don't want to get implicated in those types of debates. It's an interesting question to see if Musk can figure out that balance of allowing free speech, but also getting these large multinationals not to be afraid of going on there and advertising.
And this deal will also mean, Daniel, Twitter is going to be a private company. So talk to us about what that means, the significance of that sort of shift, and what this may say about how accountable big tech really is.
Well, let's put it this way. By making Twitter a privately held company, there is no accountability, as far as we know it, for Musk to answer to shareholders. He answers only to himself. And as well, it's problematic because we don't really have a regulatory situation where we're able to have the government step in and regulate free speech. The only things we have are things like defamation law and hate speech and criminal code offenses in most countries to address that type of speech. So it's quite a huge task for Musk to turn this into a bastion of free speech. And at the same time, it has implications because there's a lot of disinformation, things about vaccines and global climate change that are disputable content that's unscientific that's allowed to flourish on this platform, which has resulted in harm to the general public.
Daniel, the whole world was watching this story unfold today, and it's still not over. If you're someone like Mark Zuckerberg, what do you think of this?
Well, I think Zuckerberg has to be thinking that this will put more attention on what he's doing. It's sort of a bellwether effect. If Twitter creates a tumultuous, controversial type environment where there's calls for regulation, and Canada is in the midst of working on legislation to regulate platforms and their hate content and extremist content, this is going to put more pressure on Facebook as well to clean up its act.
Daniel Chai, thanks so much for your time and your perspective tonight. We appreciate this.
Okay, thank you.
The Fort York Food Bank is open once again for the first time since the pandemic started. But the reopening almost didn't happen because the shelves here were bare. The food bank on College Street has been delivering food to clients throughout the pandemic and was running low on supplies like pasta, rice, and canned vegetables due to increased demand. They put out a call for help on social media, and by noon yesterday, they had enough stock to open their doors today. For more on this, we're joined live this hour by Julie Lejeune, Executive Director of the Fort York Food Bank, City Councillor Mike Layton, and Sylvain Charlebois, a researcher in the area of food distribution, security, and safety at Dalhousie University. Thanks to all of you. Julie, let's start with what happened. Tell us a bit about what happened when you walked in. What did it look like inside on what was supposed to be a very big pandemic reopening day?
Exactly. So thanks. On Sunday, I had gone in with a couple work groups to prepare for the reopening on Tuesday morning, this morning, and I realized we were out of all of our staple items, like you mentioned, the pasta, the rice, the tuna. So I was brainstorming ways how I was going to go grocery shopping or get orders in, and in 24 hours to be able to reopen on Monday morning. And that's when I reached out to Mike Layton for help and on Twitter, and we put it out to the community, and the community just really rallied behind us, which was absolutely amazing. And they showed up and brought us food, and we were able to have, with that and some grocery shopping, full shelves this morning to start.
Okay, so Councillor Layton, tell us a bit about how you got involved here and how you were able to help at the very last moment.
Well, Julie reached out. They've been staples in our community for a number of years along DuPont and as well as College Street now. And I know how important their service is. You see the lineup growing and growing outside their door, and to have people show up to the last place they can go to get some nutrition, some food to feed their family, and to think that they'd show up and their shelves would be bare. That turns my stomach. And so I looked in my pantry, filled up a bag as best I could, as well as put a call out on Twitter. And I'm not surprised that our community showed up in great numbers. People want to help one another in our city, and we just need to give them those tools. We need to give them advice about what to do, and giving money and food to the food bank is one thing that they can do.
That's a really important point, Councillor. This is a last resort for so many people. Julie, how scary is it, to run out of food, especially at a time when so many more people are relying on food banks?
Well, I think that's really the point there, is that we are seeing new clients every day. We're open 5 days a week for groceries, and we're registering new clients every single day. So it's going up and up, and we need to be better on top of our food. We need to be ordering more. We need to make sure we have proper nutrition. Like Mike said, like proper food. We have a lot of cake mixes or something right now, or potatoes, but that's not a healthy diet. So we want to make sure we have a little bit of everything so no one has to go without.
Sylvain, food prices and food insecurity is your area of expertise. So talk us through why so many more people are relying on food banks right now.
Well, first of all, I want to say that I'm not surprised that the community in Toronto stepped up to help Julie's food bank, and because of Julie's and Mike's leadership, we were able to feed more people. So kudos to them and to the community. That being said, things are getting complicated. Things are getting rough out there. I'm just thinking about grocers. Grocers are having a hard time procuring food to serve their customers. I can't imagine how difficult it is for food banks. It's been incredibly hard. Our lab works at times with Food Banks Canada, and procuring food is becoming very, very difficult. Why? Because consumers are looking at an 8.7% inflation rate at the grocery store, and they're looking for different options. One of them is to rescue food themselves. You're using more apps. People are getting smarter when shopping, but the result is that there's less being rerouted to food banks, to food rescuing agencies like Julie's food bank. That's the problem. And that's why inflation is really pushing people to behave differently, to make different decisions, and to put more pressure on what I would call the food rescuing network.
So, Councillor Layton, what can be done, on a policy level to address this growing problem?
Well, I think many of these issues start with income supplements. And for those living at the margins, for those living on a fixed income, seniors, folks on ODSP, folks on OW in Ontario, these rates rarely change and barely meet the needs of those community members for their accommodations, for their rising rents. It leaves very little money at the end of the day, just a couple of dollars for them to pay for food. So it's no surprise that folks are relying on food banks more and more, but it doesn't have to be that way. And while we're thankful that those food banks are there, we shouldn't need to rely on them so much. We need to make changes to our income supplements, and it starts at this next provincial election.
Okay. In the meantime, though, Julie, are you concerned that, this could happen again? How do you prepare for something like this over and over again?
That's the exact point. I think I've learned a big lesson here going through this mini crisis is that we need to be better prepared. Our numbers are going up. We need to have more food. We need to do better purchasing and not have this happen again.
Sylvain, what needs to happen, for prices to calm down? When can we expect some relief here?
Well, unfortunately, if you saw in the news, the World Bank basically announced today that we're likely to see commodity prices be at a very high level for a very long time, until the end of 2024, which means to produce food will cost more money. Unfortunately, Chanel, we're not expecting any relief anytime soon. If you were to consider the current inflationary cycle as a baseball game right now, we're likely at the start of the second inning. That's where we are right now. COVID and now Ukraine has made things unbelievably cruel and complicated for the entire world.
So, Councillor Layton, you mentioned, we're very close to a provincial election. When you look ahead to what you'd like to see from the next government here in Ontario, how can they help to solve this problem? Because affordability is going to be a huge issue.
I think addressing income supports for seniors, as well as folks on adjusting the level for OW and ODSP, and then also look at some of the other costs that residents are facing in the city of Toronto. Rising rents, like this existing government scrapped rent control that was just put in place. Like, those are very real things that can impact people's budgets if there's not a control on their on the monthly expenses of rent. That people are out of affordable places to stay in our city, and so they're just paying more for those other things, leaving less money to buy other essentials. And so I think we do need to look at affordability as part of this government's message, but specifically on income supports and affordable housing would be my recommendation.
When we recognize that this is a growing problem, Julie, are you noticing, a different clientele, people coming in to get food donations that maybe didn't a year or two ago?
Yes, for sure. We see pretty much everyone. I would say the majority of our clients, though, are racialized. A lot of newcomers, refugee claimants, and people just trying to make ends meet.
I just want to leave this on a high note. Julie, what was it like finally being able to open today and see those people and be able to give them dinner?
It was incredible. I was nervous about the reopening. We've been serving pre-packs out the front door for 2 years, but we did it, and it was so exciting today. It was so wonderful to have people back in the food bank, to be able to talk to them, chat with them, welcome them back inside. And the biggest thing was to be able to give them choice, to give them agency back, to be able to choose their groceries versus having the pre-packs that we've been doing since COVID started. So it was a very exciting day.
And before we leave you, people that are watching this that may want to help out in their own communities, what kinds of things are most needed?
So at our food bank, the most needed items would be tuna, rice, canned vegetables, pasta sauce, canned beans, and yeah, we appreciate everything.
Okay. Thank you so much for your time. We appreciate this. Mike Layton, Julie Lejeune, and Sylvain Charlebois, thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
In a new report on hate-motivated threats, assaults, and vandalism, Toronto police say 2021 saw 257 hate-related incidents, more than any year since the data started being collected in 1993. Jews were victimized in 22% of the reported cases. There were 47 instances of hate crimes directed at black people and 41 against members of the Asian community. Joining us live tonight is Bernie Farber, chair of the Canadian Anti-Hate Network and former CEO of the Canadian Jewish Congress, Nigel Bariff, board chair of the Urban Alliance on Race Relations and an elementary school teacher with the TDSB, and Dr. Amy Tan, palliative care and family physician who's been outspoken about racism as a public health crisis. Bernie, I'd like to start with you. According to the Toronto Police Hate Crimes Report published today, as we mentioned, the Jewish community remains the most targeted group, victimized in 22% of hate crimes in the city, but only making up about 3.8% of the city's population. What's your take on the surge in hate crimes and how it's affecting people on a personal level here?
Well, hate crimes against Jews is nothing new, sad to say. Anti-Semitism has been with us literally since time immemorial, and when hate crimes generally rise, Jews are sadly on the top of that list. It affects people personally. It is a scary situation for all members of the Jewish community, and to be quite blunt about it, this has probably been the most difficult time over the last 3 or 4 years, and certainly social media has provided a platform for people with hate in their hearts to actually get their message out, and for those who are inclined to take matters into their own hands to act out physically. And we've seen that not just in relation to anti-Semitism, but certainly in relation to anti-black crime, crimes against South Asians and others. This is just a bad time.
Now, Bernie, you mentioned specifically the last few years. How has the pandemic really exacerbated this problem?
Well, the pandemic has sort of become a tool for action amongst racists and bigots. We saw during the convoy, for example, probably the largest display of anti-Semitic and racist material ever seen on Parliament Hill. The Nazi crooked cross, the swastika, the Confederate flag, and so much else. It has just been a time where hate has exploded, and we haven't really done enough about it, in my view.
Dr. Tan, I'd like to switch to you for a moment. You've taken to Twitter to call out racism, particularly in the healthcare community, but of course, that's a platform, social media, where you can open yourself up to a lot of attacks. Talk about your personal experience and how much you push back against online hate as you try to go up against it online.
Well, I think being outspoken about the pandemic with regards to protective measures and being East Asian myself, we know that the increase in anti-East Asian and Southeast Asian sentiment has been hand in hand with the pandemic, and this goes back to the Yellow Peril from the late 1800s in Canada with the railway and the Chinese railway workers. And when they were no longer welcome in Canada, they started to associate us with the Yellow Peril, pestilence, and disease. And so this is what's happening with the pandemic. And so when I am identified as an Asian woman speaking out about things that people perhaps don't agree with, or they want their quote-unquote freedoms, they lash out to people who look like me, and they will blame people in my community for this disease because of the origins in Asia, and also because of the racist connotations with regards to masking and the submissiveness that many people who are against masking really associate masking with. And so it's been a daily onslaught of abuse, and I have to use blocking apps and filter my emails to deal with this.
So, Dr. Tan, how do you deal with that on a personal level? No doubt it must affect your mental health, dealing with people lashing out on social media. Many of them, you don't even know exactly who they are.
Yeah, I mean, it does affect me. I'm human. I'm not going to say that it doesn't affect me, but it really speaks to, I think, where Canadian society is. And I think I have an opportunity and an obligation to shine a light on the fact that racism exists in Canada every day. And it's not even just about hate. It is about this notion of superiority and how anybody who's not of European descent, people feel that they can lash out on us. And so it really is about me trying to use the privilege I have for good, I hope, in shining a light and hopefully being able to be in solidarity with Black, Indigenous, and other racialized people, Muslims and Jewish people, with regards to the fact that this is not okay for any human being to be lashed out on and treated inhumanely.
Right. Now, Nigel, in your role with the Urban Alliance on Race Relations, as well as your work as a school teacher, so no doubt a lot of one-on-one time with with kids and students, what more needs to be done to change attitudes toward different communities here?
I mean, one of my worries or concern is that we have to deal with it right in our classrooms right now. And when we hear things like the N-word being used, or we see anti-Semitic symbols being painted inside of schools, we need school boards. We need the provincial government to provide the type of training, to provide the curriculum expectations to deal with these things at a grassroots level in the classrooms. Right now, most school boards aren't given any funding to actually go and do this work with their staff. We can't say that this is an issue and not make the financial investment to deal with it.
Now, Bernie, if I can go back to you, many events are happening tonight. It's the beginning of Holocaust Memorial Day. How important are these events, particularly with hate crimes, as we're reporting on the rise?
The genocide of the Jewish people during the Holocaust is the single most important event of the modern era. 6 million Jews, men, women, and 1.5 million children were murdered simply because they were Jews. My father's family was amongst them. He was the sole Jewish survivor of his small Polish town. 750 Jews, his first wife, 2 children, brothers, sisters, cousins, friends. This has a huge impact, and the ability to be able to remember, to talk about it, to feel it, it brings hate right to the forefront. And so tonight being Yom HaShoah, with commemorations going on at Earl Bales Park and other places literally around the country, I think this is an opportunity to open people's eyes, to have people remember what hate can do, where it leads. It leads to the gas chambers of Auschwitz and Treblinka and Sobibor and the rest.
Right, and that's, of course, we're talking not a history of hundreds of years ago. This is something that happened just
in living memory.
In living
memory, Scott.
So, Nigel, back to you. According to Toronto Police, the report today, overall hate crimes is way above the 10-year average. And it's not just about meeting the threshold of a crime, as Steve Ryan was talking about a little bit. Excuse me. These incidents can have a negative impact on someone. Talk about other forms of racism here, not just crimes. We're talking microaggression, things like that, that can make someone feel marginalized.
I mean, look, this happens on a daily basis. The anti-Semitism, the anti-Black racism, the anti-Asian racism, and we can talk about it at nauseum. What concerns me about the report, though, is how underreported this most likely is, that we don't have a system that actually encourages more reporting. And then even when people are reporting, we don't actually have a system where it's taken seriously and that charges are laid and that we hold these perpetrators of this hate accountable. What's also very frightening to me is that we know that within our Canadian Armed Forces, within the Toronto Police, within the police services, that we actually have Nazis and white supremacists that have identified themselves during the Freedom Convoy. So there's a lot of work that we need to do, and that this report is just, I mean, it's important for us to talk about, but we need an actual plan, and we need actual resources to deal with this. And finally, we need to hold politicians that are seeking their seeking right-wing politicians that are seeking the wanting to connect with those folk. We have to hold them accountable in these situations also.
Now, Dr. Tan, you're based in BC, and during the pandemic in particular, I can speak to this. I was based out of BC the last couple of years. There's been quite a rise in anti-Asian hate. Have you likened racism to a public health crisis? Do we need to tackle this with the same vigor as we've been going after the pandemic, let's say? And what exactly does that look like?
We absolutely do, because all roads actually lead back to systemic racism and racism. So we're seeing with COVID-19, who is being disproportionately affected? It is the racialized communities and the intersection of low-income communities and families, employment precarity, immigration status precarity. And we need to be looking at this and really urgently looking at race-based data and also looking at specific interventions. And we need to be realizing this is the truth of our society. We will not, COVID-19 is only showing the symptoms of this problem. It is a deeply entrenched, inequitable system that is based on systemic racism, and we need to address it if we have any hope of actually having our communities be much more healthy than they are.
Okay, Bernie Farber, Nigel Barrafin, Dr. Amy Tan, thank you all for joining us tonight.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for having me.
All donors will be screened for high-risk sexual behavior regardless of gender identity or sexual orientation. Our government welcomes this decision. It's been a long time coming. The current approach was discriminatory and wrong. This is a significant milestone in moving forward on both the safety of our blood supply, but also non-discriminatory practices.
Today, Health Canada announced it's ending the policy that restricts men who have sex with men from donating blood for 3 months. Screening will be based instead on high-risk sexual behavior. By the end of September, potential donors will be asked if they have had new or multiple sexual partners in the last 3 months, no matter their gender or sexual orientation. The agency says this will allow it to more reliably assess the risk of infections such as HIV. Joining us live tonight with their reaction, Eric Duncan, Conservative MP for Stormont, Dundas, South Glengarry, Pranay Anand, Executive Director of the Alliance for South Asian AIDS Prevention, Toronto, and David Brennan, Professor of Social Work at University of Toronto. Eric, let's begin with you. You've been very open about your personal story, how it felt that first time you tried to give blood. Briefly walk us through how it made you feel then, and with that in mind, how important today is on a personal level.
So for myself, I've considered myself very fortunate in my coming out story and coming out as gay and living in a rural Eastern Ontario town. And one of the few times, thankfully, that I've felt stigma or discrimination or something uncomfortable was when at the age of 17, about 17 years ago, I tried to go in and donate blood for the first time, like my family had been doing for generations. And the emotions that day, realizing that I was not allowed, felt like there was something wrong with me. I wasn't out at the time, so I had to go through and pretend like I was donating blood, put a sticker to show that no, my donation wouldn't be accepted. I remember going back to my car that night and thinking, when that blood donation got to Canadian Blood Services, it was going in the dumpster simply for the reason I was gay. And so today, I think the word I would say is I feel relieved that there's actually a date to bring an end to this. It's taken a long time, frankly, too long to do. But we owe it to thousands of people that have shared their stories and experiences to finally get here.
Long time coming. Pranay, Canada introduced a lifetime ban for gay men 30 years ago in 1992. Take us back to why this was first introduced in the first place.
Well, it started with the stigma, not knowing enough about sexual orientation on gay men. It's got a lot to do with the scare around HIV. It's got to do a lot around not knowing, the fear of unknown, as I say, of what gay sex is and what people do and sexual behaviors and what does safety look like. So it's outright discriminatory. And it's been a long time coming, and it's been decades since we've been advocating for a policy that does not discriminate against gay people for donating blood simply because they're gay, simply because of their sexual orientation.
Yeah, you mentioned much more fear-based than scientific based in science. So, David, if it was a simple fix, just changing the questionnaire, and the Prime Minister said it's been long discriminatory, as Pranay mentioned as well, why did it take so long?
Yeah, I think that's a really great question. I think there's a lot of, as Pranay mentioned, there's been a lot of stigma associated with sex that happens between men, quite frankly. And because of that stigma, there's been a lot of desire to overprotect the blood supply. There was a reason to do it initially in terms of the fact that there were a few transmissions of HIV early on before we had testing. But once we've had good and solid testing, which, by the way, we've had for over 30 years, there it wasn't a reason anymore to continue this ban. I think, or the deferral policy. I think part of the reason is the thought behind it is that if we can reduce the possibility of the number of people that would test positive and, you know, as an agency, we'd have to manage or deal with that, then it might make sense to figure out another way to cut people out of the process by asking them about their sexual orientation. The problem is, it identifies a whole class of people. It wasn't really based on behavior. And quite frankly, it wasn't really based in science. Most gay men right now are very aware of HIV. They're probably, more aware than most other people, and are taking precautions between, condom usage or taking medication to treat their HIV or prevent HIV transmission. The actual risk of HIV transmission has been dropping dramatically for a long time. And as one of the scientists who put together a study to look at some of this data and this information, we very quickly learned, this was not a useful or relevant policy anymore. We needed to not make it about a group, but make it about behavior.
So, Eric, how impactful will it be to allow more men to donate blood, considering how badly blood is always needed?
Well, absolutely, to that point. There has been a desperate call, and particularly during COVID with shutdowns and not being able to use community centers for mobile clinics and so forth, there's been urgent appeals for it. So the fact now that the potential donor pool is open to thousands and thousands of men across the country now, coming in September. I'm a bit frustrated at the deadline of needing to take 5 months to actually implement this change. We've known about this change coming, but nevertheless, this is going to allow more men to safely donate blood and make a difference in this country. There's a need for it, and this could address part of it.
Of course, yeah. At least now there's a, it's not immediate, but at least now there's an end date. So Pranay, talk about the advocacy that's gotten us here to this point, and all the work that's gone into overturning this ban.
Well, people have shared their stories. Research has been done. We've been, for decades, we've been saying this is not okay. And this is not the only time gay men are saying a policy against us is not okay, it's discrimination. However, this is one clear example where mystery and lack of information and lack of, where policy doesn't catch up with science, where education is not prioritized. As David said, gay men are very, very, very aware of sexual health and their and HIV prevention. So on the one hand, we're talking about PrEP, we're talking about U equals U, we're talking about HIV prevention. But on the other hand, policy is really not catching up with the science. And that's a huge problem. And people have shared their stories, as I said, and there's been tremendous amount of qualitative and quantitative research being done. People have talked about how they feel in instances where they're turned away by CBS and saying, we cannot take your blood, just simply because of who you are.
So, David, let's talk about the stigma here. There talked about the idea or the possibility of being turned away just because of you're being a gay man. What does this mean for removing the stigma surrounding gay men and HIV? As all of you have mentioned, gay men might be some of the most educated on safe sex and HIV. So this really must go a long way to removing stigma around that.
Well, it's certainly, I would hope that it would create a much larger openness and awareness about how the stigmatizing of blood is highly problematic. I can guarantee you right now that my Twitter feed or any other kind of social media or comments and any articles about this story, there are going to be lots of very homophobic comments written about the change in this policy. There are still people who believe, I don't want the blood that comes from a gay man. I kid you not. I can guarantee you, if you want evidence, I'll show it to you tomorrow. It'll be there. This will help, though, because it kind of it takes out the idea that we're talking about a specific group of people. And instead, we're focusing on the kinds of behaviors or the number or new partners that people might be having that might be increasing risk, regardless of gender. And by the way, this actually also helps to address issues around whether trans people can donate blood as well, because they have to often answer a lot of very personal, invasive questions about their bodies. And at this point, it would be the same question that other people would be asked as well. So there's also an impact here, I think, for our trans community members as well.
All right, so of course a good step forward in removing the stigma, but no doubt still lots of work to do. Eric Duncan, Pranay Anand, and David Brennan, thanks so much for joining us on this big day tonight.
Thank you
very much.